The Letter That Doomed Them All, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a letter, simple, sealed, and delivered without warning. It arrived quietly, passed from hand to hand, and read in silence, yet from that moment on, nothing in the village remained the same. No one would admit what the letter contained. No one would explain why it mattered. But Miss Marple noticed the change, the nervous glances, the hushed conversations, and the sudden fear that settled over those who had seen it. As she begins to piece things together, it becomes clear that the letter was never meant to inform. It was meant to threaten. And whatever words were written inside, they carried enough truth to destroy more than one life. Because sometimes, it only takes a few lines of ink to seal a terrible fate. Before we uncover what was written in the letter that doomed them all, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Letter That Arrived Too Late. The village of Harrowby had long mastered the art of quiet living, where every day unfolded with predictable calm and nothing truly unexpected was allowed to take root. People spoke in measured tones, routines were followed without question, and the past, no matter how heavy, was left undisturbed. It was a place where silence was not only valued but protected. And perhaps that was why, when the letter arrived, no one recognized it as the beginning of something far more dangerous than a simple message on paper. It came with the morning post, unnoticed among the usual collection of envelopes that carried nothing more than ordinary concerns. The envelope itself was plain, cream-colored, and slightly worn, as though it had traveled further than the others. There was no return address, no sign of where it had come from, only a name written in careful, steady handwriting that seemed almost too precise to be natural. Mrs. Eleanor Finch, the housekeeper of Ashcroft Manor. A woman who prided herself on order, discipline, and a life free from unnecessary complication. She accepted the post at the door as she always did, offering a brief nod before stepping back into the controlled quiet of the manor. At first, she treated the letter like any other, placing it neatly with the rest as she moved through her morning duties. Tea was prepared, the sitting room arranged, the small details of the house corrected with the same silent efficiency that had defined her for years. Yet even as she worked, her attention returned, again and again, to that single envelope. There was something about it that did not belong. Perhaps it was the weight of it, slightly heavier than expected. Perhaps it was the way her name had been written, not hurried, not careless, but deliberate, as though each letter carried intention. Or perhaps it was something less visible, something that could not be explained but was felt all the same. Whatever the reason, the letter refused to be ignored. At last, when her duties allowed a moment of stillness, Mrs. Finch took the envelope into the small sitting area near the window, where the pale morning light offered a clear view of its surface. She turned it over once, then again, as if expecting some hidden detail to reveal itself. Finding nothing, she opened it with careful precision, sliding the paper free without tearing the edges. Inside was a single sheet. No greeting. No signature. No unnecessary words. Only a message written in the same controlled hand. You all thought it was over. You were wrong. Mrs. Finch read the sentence slowly, her expression unchanged, but something shifted behind her composed exterior. The words were simple, yet they carried a meaning that could not be dismissed. This was not a mistake, not a piece of misdirected correspondence. It was intentional. It was specific. And most importantly, it was correct. Because there had been something. Something long buried. Something that was never meant to return. For several moments, she remained seated, the letter resting lightly between her fingers as her mind moved through memories she had not allowed herself to revisit in years. Then, with a quiet decisiveness, she rose and made her way to Mr. Harold Ashcroft's study. He was already inside, seated at his desk, reading through the morning paper with the calm authority that had defined him for decades. He did not look up immediately when she entered, but he sensed the change in her presence. Mrs. Finch did not interrupt without reason. "What is it?" he asked, folding the paper with measured care. She stepped forward and placed the letter before him without a word. Mr. Ashcroft glanced at it briefly, then more closely. His eyes moved across the single line, and for a fraction of a second, something broke through his composure. It was not fear, not openly, but recognition. A flicker of understanding that he could not fully conceal. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He leaned back slightly, exhaling in a controlled manner, as though the message had already been reduced to something insignificant. "A foolish attempt to stir trouble," he said, his voice steady though not quite as firm as it should have been. "Nothing more than that." Mrs. Finch did not respond. She simply watched him. Because she noticed what others might not have. The slight delay before he spoke. The way his fingers lingered on the paper. And most telling of all, the fact that he did not discard the letter. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it inside the drawer of his desk, locking it with a small, deliberate motion. That was when she understood. This was not over. By midday, the unease had begun to spread, though no one spoke of it directly. The village carried on as it always did, but there was a difference in the air, something subtle yet undeniable. Conversations felt shorter. Smiles less certain. Those who had lived in Harrowby long enough, those who remembered more than they admitted, felt the quiet return of something they had hoped was gone forever. Because the truth was simple. The letter had not come from nowhere. It had come from the past. And the past, once disturbed, does not settle easily again. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, another letter was being delivered elsewhere in the village. This one did not go to Ashcroft Manor. It was addressed to a different name. A man who had once stood alongside Mr. Ashcroft, bound by a shared secret that had never truly faded. Dr. Lionel Reeves. Like the first, the envelope carried no return address. Like the first, the handwriting was precise, controlled, and unmistakably intentional. And inside, the message waited, silent but certain. "You remember what we did?" Before the night was over, the storm would arrive. And by morning, Harrowby would no longer be a place of quiet safety. Because the past had finally chosen to speak. And it had begun with a letter that should never have been written. Chapter 2: The Secret They Buried. The morning after the storm carried a silence that felt unnatural, as though the village of Harrowby itself was holding its breath. The rain had washed the streets clean, but it had not taken the unease with it. Instead, that unease lingered, heavier now, settled into the walls of houses and the minds of those who lived within them. And before the day had properly begun, the first undeniable consequence of the letter came to light. Dr. Lionel Reeves was found dead in his study. There was nothing outwardly violent about the scene, which made it all the more disturbing. He sat in his chair as though he had simply paused in the middle of his work, his hands resting near the desk, his expression calm in a way that did not belong to death. The room itself remained untouched, every object in its place, every surface undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of intrusion, nothing that suggested force. And yet, the truth pressed in from every corner. This had not been natural. The letter lay open before him. It was positioned carefully, almost deliberately, as though it had been meant to be seen first. The same precise handwriting marked the page, the same controlled message that offered no comfort and no explanation. Only certainty. Only memory. Inspector Hale arrived soon after, his presence firm and methodical, bringing with it the expectation that reason would prevail. He examined the room with practiced efficiency, noting each detail, each absence, each possibility. But the more he looked, the less he found. There was no clear entry point, no sign of disturbance, no immediate cause that could explain what had happened. It could be natural, he said at first, though even he did not sound convinced. Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly and without announcement, stood near the doorway, observing rather than interfering. Her attention moved slowly, not searching for what was obvious, but for what did not fit. "It is too neat," she said softly. Inspector Hale glanced at her. "Neat does not mean murder." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But it often suggests preparation." Her gaze shifted to the desk, to the glass that stood beside the letter, to the small details that others might dismiss. "Nothing here is accidental," she continued. "Everything has been left exactly as it should be seen." The inspector frowned slightly, but he did not dismiss her words. There was something about the scene that resisted simple explanation, something that suggested intention rather than chance. The answer came later that day. The medical report confirmed the presence of poison, subtle and carefully administered. It was not something that could have been taken unknowingly, nor was it something easily obtained. It required knowledge, access, and above all, a deliberate decision. This was not fear acting in haste. This was control. This was revenge carried out with patience. The news spread through Harrowby with quiet efficiency, never openly discussed but understood by all. The letter could no longer be dismissed as a prank or a meaningless threat. It had been followed by death, and that connection changed everything. Margaret Hale came forward before evening. She had tried, at first, to remain silent, convincing herself that what had been buried should remain buried. But Dr. Reeves's death had made that impossible. The past was no longer distant. It had returned with purpose, and it was moving closer. She arrived pale and unsettled, her usual composure weakened by something she could no longer control. In her hand, she carried an envelope. Identical to the others. "I received this yesterday," she said, her voice quiet but unsteady. She handed it over, and the message inside spoke for itself. "We agreed never to speak of it." Inspector Hale read the words carefully, his expression tightening as the meaning became clear. This was not random. This was directed. Someone knew something, and they intended to make it known. "Who agreed?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, but only for a moment. There was no use avoiding it anymore. "All of us," she said. The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. "Who is all of us?" the inspector pressed. Margaret took a breath, as though preparing herself to reopen something she had long tried to forget. "Mr. Harold Ashcroft," she began. "Dr. Reeves. Thomas Whitaker. And myself." She paused briefly, her voice lowering as she added, "and Clara Bennett." The name carried a different weight, one that shifted the entire meaning of the conversation. It was not just another person. It was the center of it all. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her interest sharpened. "What happened to Clara Bennett?" she asked. Margaret's hands tightened slightly, her gaze dropping as the memory resurfaced. "It was years ago," she said slowly. "Before everything became quiet. Before the village settled into what it is now." Her voice faltered, but she continued. "She died. It was ruled an accident. A fall near the quarry. Miss Marple did not react immediately. She simply watched Margaret, waiting for what had not yet been said. "And was it an accident?" she asked gently. Margaret did not answer. Because she did not need to. At that moment, the door opened with sudden urgency, and Thomas Whittaker entered. His usual calm was gone, replaced by a tension that could no longer be hidden. His face was pale, his movements sharp, as though he had finally reached a point where silence was no longer possible. "We cannot keep this hidden," he said, his voice strained. "Not anymore." Inspector Hale turned to him. "Then tell us the truth." Whittaker hesitated, but only briefly. The pressure had built too far, and now it had nowhere left to go. "We were all there that night," he said. "Every one of us." Clara knew something she should not have known. "What kind of information?" the inspector asked. Whittaker glanced toward the floor before answering. "Something about Ashcroft's business. Something serious enough to ruin him completely." The implication was clear. "And she confronted him," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Whittaker replied. "She demanded that the truth come out. She said she would expose everything." "And what happened next?" the inspector asked. Whittaker's expression tightened as he forced himself to continue. "There was an argument," he said. "It became heated. Voices were raised. No one was thinking clearly." He paused, as though trying to choose his words carefully, but there was no gentle way to say it. "She ended up near the edge," he continued. "And then, she was pushed." The room fell into silence. "By whom?" the inspector asked immediately. Whittaker shook his head, frustration and guilt mixing in his expression. "I did not see it clearly. It happened too fast. But we all knew it was not an accident." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet," she said, "you all agreed to say that it was." Whittaker looked at her, the weight of that decision clear in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "We told the same story. We supported each other. We made sure it would not be questioned." "Why?" the inspector demanded. "Because the truth would have destroyed everything," Whittaker replied. "Ashcroft's reputation, Reeves's career, Margaret's standing, all of it. And he stopped, unable to finish the thought. Miss Marple completed it for him, her voice calm and certain. "And you believed that silence would protect you?" Whittaker nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but there was something final in her tone when she spoke again. "Silence does not protect," she said. "It delays." The realization settled heavily over the room. This was not just about what had happened. This was about what had been hidden. And someone, somewhere, had decided that it would remain hidden no longer. As night fell once again over Harrowby, the tension deepened. The truth had begun to surface, but it had not yet finished. The letters were not random messages. They were part of a design, a sequence that moved forward with careful intention. Thomas Whittaker returned home that night with the knowledge that everything had changed. He understood now that the past had not been buried. It had been waiting. And as he entered his house, unaware that he was no longer safe, another letter had already reached him. It waited where he would see it. It waited to be read. Inside, the message was simple. You should have told the truth. By morning, Thomas Whittaker was dead. And the secret they had buried was no longer hidden. It was being uncovered, one life at a time. Chapter 3, The Letter That Doomed Them All. By the time the third death cast its shadow over Harrowby, the village had begun to understand the truth it had tried so long to avoid. This was not a series of accidents, nor a string of disconnected acts driven by impulse. It was something far more controlled, far more deliberate. The letters had not simply warned. They had guided what followed. Each message had been a step, and each step had brought the past closer to the surface. Fear settled into the village fully now, no longer hidden behind polite silence or careful denial. Doors were locked earlier, voices lowered further, and even those who knew nothing of Clara Bennett could feel the weight of something unfinished pressing in around them. Because what had once been buried had not disappeared. It had endured, waiting for the right moment to return. Only two of them remained. Margaret Hale and Harold Ashcroft. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room of Ashcroft Manor, her expression thoughtful, her presence calm in a house that no longer felt secure. Inspector Hale stood nearby, his frustration evident as he tried to impose order on something that refused to behave logically. "We have motive," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Revenge. That much is clear. But we still need proof. We need to know who is doing this before it happens again." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the fading light of the afternoon stretched thin across the grounds. "It will happen again," she said gently. Inspector Hale turned sharply. "Then we stop it." Miss Marple's gaze returned to him, steady and certain. "We cannot stop what has already been set in motion," she said. "But we can understand it. And understanding will show us who is responsible." Before he could respond, the door opened abruptly. A servant entered, pale and shaken, struggling to find the right words. "It is Miss Hale," he said at last. "She has been found." The room seemed to tighten. Margaret Hale was discovered in her home, her attempt to escape already too late. Unlike the others, there had been signs of distress, of movement, of fear that had finally broken through her composure. But the result remained the same. She was dead. And beside her, placed where it could not be missed, was another letter. By the time Miss Marple and the inspector arrived, the pattern had become undeniable. Each victim had received a message that forced them to remember, to confront what they had done, before death followed with quiet certainty. "This is not rage," Miss Marple said softly as she looked at the letter. "This is intention. Every step is chosen." Inspector Hale clenched his jaw. "Then there is only one left. Harold Ashcroft." They returned to the manor at once. Ashcroft was waiting. The confidence that had once defined him had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who could no longer deny what he had spent years avoiding. He sat in his study, the same room where the first letter had been locked away, but now there was no sense of control left in him. He looked at Miss Marple as she entered, and for the first time, there was no attempt to maintain appearances. "It was me," he said. The words came without resistance, as though he had already accepted that they could no longer be held back. Miss Marple did not react with surprise. She simply stepped forward. "Tell it clearly," she said. Ashcroft's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady enough to carry the truth. "She came to confront me," he said. "Clara Bennett. She knew about my dealings. She knew enough to destroy everything I had built. She threatened to expose it all, to ruin me completely." He paused, his expression tightening as the memory took hold. "We argued," he continued. "She would not back down. She stood there, certain that she was right, certain that the truth mattered more than anything else." Miss Marple said nothing. She allowed him to continue. "I lost control," he said at last. It was not planned. It was not something I had intended. But in that moment, I pushed her. The room fell into silence. And the others? Inspector Hale asked. They saw it, Ashcroft replied. Every one of them knew what had happened. And they chose to protect themselves. We all did. We agreed on the same story. We made sure it would never be questioned. You buried the truth, Miss Marple said. Yes. And you believed it would remain buried. Ashcroft closed his eyes briefly. Yes. There was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the room with quiet finality. A servant entered, carrying an envelope. Another letter. Addressed to Harold Ashcroft. His hand shook as he took it, the weight of it far greater than paper should allow. For a moment, he did not open it, as though delaying the inevitable could still change something. But there was no escape left. He unfolded the paper slowly. Inside, the message was as precise as all the others. You were the one who started it. Ashcroft lowered the letter, his face drained of what little composure remained. Miss Marple watched him carefully, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts already complete. It is not only revenge, she said quietly. It is memory. Every letter forces the truth back into the open. Every message is a step toward this moment. Inspector Hale turned to her. Then who is behind it? Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the door, toward the quiet presence that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The person who was there all along, she said. Mrs. Eleanor Finch stood in the doorway. Calm. Still. Unafraid. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the truth settled into place. You received the first letter, Inspector Hale said slowly. Yes, Mrs. Finch replied. And you showed it to Ashcroft, he continued. Yes. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, her voice gentle but certain. You made sure the pattern began exactly as it needed to, she said. You placed yourself at the start, so no one would ever suspect you were at the end. Mrs. Finch did not deny it. Instead, she looked directly at Ashcroft. You remember her, she said. Ashcroft's expression shifted, recognition breaking through the fear. Clara, he whispered. My sister, Mrs. Finch said. The silence that followed was complete. I left this village after her death, she continued. I watched as all of you carried on, as though nothing had happened. As though her life meant nothing. And I waited. Her voice did not rise. It did not break. It remained controlled, just as it had always been. I came back when no one would question it, she said. I became someone invisible. Someone trusted. Someone who could stand in the same room as all of you and never be seen for what I truly was. And the letters? Miss Marple asked. They were never warnings, Mrs. Finch replied. They were reminders. Each of them needed to remember before they died. That was the point. Inspector Hale stepped forward. And the poison? I prepared for years, she said simply. I made sure there would be no mistakes. Ashcroft stared at her, the full weight of his actions finally reflected back at him. You killed them all, he said. Yes, she replied. And now me. Mrs. Finch held his gaze. Yes. Inspector Hale moved quickly then, stepping between them. That will not happen, he said firmly. It ends here. Mrs. Finch did not resist as she was taken into custody. She did not struggle, did not argue, did not attempt to escape. her purpose had already been fulfilled. The sequence had been completed. The truth had been forced into the open. And the letter had done exactly what it was meant to do. In the quiet that followed, Harrowby began, slowly, to return to something resembling its former self. But it was not the same. It could never be the same. Because the silence it once relied on had been broken, and in its place remained something far more difficult to ignore. Truth. Miss Marple stood by the window of Ashcroft Manor, watching as the evening light faded into night. "People believe the past can be left behind," she said softly. "But it does not disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it does so with purpose." Behind her, no one argued. Because now, they understood. The letter had not just delivered a message. It had delivered judgment. If you enjoyed this mystery and want more intense stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves deep, dark mysteries. Because in stories like these, the truth never stays buried, and sometimes, all it takes is one letter to bring everything crashing down.